Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a case out of Minnesota that has never quite sat right with anyone who has taken the time to look at it closely. A 32-year-old man named Henry McCabe, an auditor for the state, a husband, a father of two, went out with people he called friends on a Sunday night in the early fall of 2015. Sometime a little after 2 in the morning, he was dropped off alone at a gas station a few miles from his own front door, with no wallet and no keys in his pocket. And then he was gone. What he left behind was not a note, not a witness, not a clear trail. What he left behind was a phone call, roughly 2 minutes of it, recorded by accident on the voicemail of the people who loved him most. 2 minutes that would be the last anyone ever heard of his voice, and that no one, not his family, not the local police, not even the FBI, has ever been able to fully explain. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in what we do here. No pressure and no guilt if you would rather not. And thank you, truly, for all the case suggestions you keep sending. So many of them, like this one, are cases that deserve far more attention than they ever got. We're also now on Spotify, so if you would rather listen there, in the dark, with your eyes closed, the link is in the description below. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and get comfortable. This is a long one, and Henry's story deserves to be heard carefully from the beginning, without rushing to the part everyone remembers. Because before he was a voicemail that strangers on the internet would argue about for years, he was a person. He was a man who got up and went to a job he was proud of, who had a wife and 2 kids waiting for him, who by every account anyone has offered was simply living an ordinary, decent life. The kind of life that is not supposed to end with a mystery. So let's step back for a moment, and let's be honest about how little we truly know. What happened in the roughly 40 minutes between the moment a friend's car pulled away from that gas station and the moment that call came through? Why did the accounts given by some of the people closest to him fail to line up with what the cameras later showed? And why, all these years later, with modern forensic tools and federal help, has no one ever been able to say for certain what those sounds on the recording actually were? To even begin to sit with those questions, we need to start where every one of these stories should start. Not with how Henry McCabe died, but with who he was. Let's talk about Henry Toby. McCabe was a Liberian-American man who had built a quiet, stable life in the northern suburbs of Minneapolis, in a small city called Mounds View, Minnesota. If you have never been to that part of the country, picture a landscape of modest single-family homes and long, straight roads, of strip malls and gas stations and chain restaurants, of lakes scattered so thickly through the region that Minnesota built its whole identity around them. It is the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where winters are long and hard and communal, and where a man raising a family and going to work every day is exactly as unremarkable and exactly as valuable as he is meant to be. Henry fit into that world completely. He was, by all accounts, unassuming. He was not a public figure, not a man who courted attention. He was just Henry. He worked as an auditor for the Minnesota Department of Revenue, which is a detail worth sitting with for a second, because of what it tells you about the kind of person he was. Auditing is careful work. It is methodical, precise, and unglamorous. It is a job for someone who pays attention to the details, who follows a process, who understands that small things matter and that the numbers have to add up. The people who knew him professionally described a man who took that job seriously, who valued it, who did not miss work, and that ordinary reliability would later become one of the first quiet alarms in this story, because a man like that does not simply fail to show up. He was, more than anything, a family man. Henry had been married to his wife, Corinne, for roughly 11 years by the fall of 2015. Together, they were raising 2 children, and if you have ever raised young kids, you know what that life looks like from the inside. It looks like early mornings and packed schedules, like the low hum of a household that runs on routine, like 1,000 small acts of care that no one outside the family ever sees. That was the shape of Henry's life. Work, home, family, community, the kind of life that does not make headlines and that was never supposed to. He was also part of Minnesota's Liberian American community, which is one of the largest in the entire United States. Thousands of Liberians settled in the Twin Cities area over the decades, many of them after fleeing civil war and hardship back home, building new lives in a cold and unfamiliar place through sheer determination and the strength of one another. To be described, as Henry was, as a prominent man within that community, is to understand that he was known. He was connected. He was surrounded by people who cared about him, who would notice his absence and who would refuse in the months to come to simply let his case fade quietly away. That community would become the reason this story did not disappear entirely. Have you ever thought about how much of a person's life leaves no record at all? We live in an age of cameras and phones and digital footprints, and yet the truest parts of a person, the way they laughed, the way they worried, the small kindnesses they showed the people around them, almost never get written down anywhere. When someone vanishes, we are left trying to reconstruct a whole human being out of fragments, a physical description on a police bulletin, a job title, a marriage certificate. The public record of Henry McCabe tells us that he was a man of around 5 feet 11 inches, weighing roughly 170 pounds, in his early 30s, an auditor, a husband, a father. But those are just the edges of him. The center, the part that mattered most to the people who loved him, is something we can only approach with care and humility, knowing we will never fully reach it. Now picture a Sunday like the ones Henry would have known. It is early September in Minnesota, that brief and beautiful window when the brutal cold has not yet arrived, but you can feel it coming in the evenings. The light gets golden and low. Families are squeezing out the last of the summer. There are cookouts and lawns being mowed and kids riding bikes in the long light before dinner. For a working man with young children, a weekend like that is a small stretch of peace before the machinery of the week starts up again. His wife and children were away that particular weekend, visiting family out in California. And so Henry, on that early September Sunday, had a rare thing for a busy father. He had a night to himself. There is nothing unusual about that. There is nothing wrong with it. A man whose family is out of town, who decides to go out on a Sunday evening and spend some time with friends, is doing the most ordinary thing in the world. That is what makes this story so quietly devastating, because everything about that night, right up until the moment it wasn't, was completely, reassuringly normal. Henry was not doing anything reckless. He was not somewhere he should not have been. He was a grown man going out for the evening in his own community, expecting, as we all expect every single time, to come home afterward. You're in Mounds View, Minnesota, in early September of 2015. The air is cooling as the sun goes down. Somewhere in a quiet suburban house, a man is getting ready to go out, checking his phone, grabbing his keys, telling himself he will not stay out too late because there is work in the morning and the numbers do not audit themselves. It is the kind of evening that repeats itself millions of times over across the country every single weekend and almost always ends with everyone getting home safe. That ordinariness is not a small detail. Hold on to it, because the horror of what follows is not in anything dramatic or cinematic. It is in the fact that this could have been anyone. It could have been someone you love. It could have been you. To be fair to everyone involved, and we will try very hard throughout this to be fair to everyone involved, the beginning of that evening seems to have been exactly what it looked like. Some friends, a night out, a few drinks. There is no sign that Henry left home that Sunday expecting anything other than a good time and a safe trip back. And that is where we have to go next. We have to walk through that last night as carefully as we can, hour by hour, following Henry from his own front door out into the September dark. Because somewhere in the space of a few hours, an ordinary night out turned into one of Minnesota's most enduring, unsolved mysteries. And the last person who can tell us exactly how has been gone for a very long time. Let's go back to that night. The last confirmed day of Henry McCabe's life was Sunday, the 6th of September, 2015. To understand it, we have to rely on what the people who were with him told investigators afterward, and on the handful of hard facts that cameras and cell towers were able to confirm. And this is where the story starts to require real care, because the human accounts and the physical evidence do not always agree, and the gaps between them are where this case lives. By the accounts given later, Henry spent much of that day in the company of a man named William Kennedy, an acquaintance who went by the nickname Papaus. The two of them, according to what was told to police, had been together for a good part of the day before the evening even began. At some point that night, they made a plan that millions of people make on any given weekend. They decided to go out. The destination was a club in Spring Lake Park called Pavlitsky's on 65, a local spot in that northern stretch of the Minneapolis suburbs. And they were not alone. At least one other friend was there with them that night, a man named Calvin Johnson. So picture the three of them arriving, a club on a Sunday night in a Minnesota suburb, not a glamorous place, just a familiar one. Music, drinks, the low roar of other people's conversations. For Henry, whose family was a couple thousand miles away in California for the weekend, it was a rare and simple pleasure. A night out with friends. Nothing more than that. Now, according to what Kennedy and Johnson later told investigators, Henry was drinking heavily that night. Heavily enough that, by their account, his friends grew concerned. And this is the first detail that we need to hold carefully, because it becomes important later, and because it can be read in more than one way. His friends said that because Henry was so intoxicated, they took steps to look after him. They took his wallet so he could not keep buying drinks, and they took his car keys so that he could not get behind the wheel and try to drive himself home in that condition. On its face, that is an act of friendship. That is what you are supposed to do for a friend who has had too much. You take the keys. You do not let them drive. Anyone who has ever been the sober one at the end of a long night understands the instinct completely. To be fair to Kennedy and Johnson, that is exactly how they framed it. And it is entirely possible that is exactly what it was. But hold that image in your mind anyway, because it creates a very specific situation. By the end of that night, Henry McCabe, deeply intoxicated according to his friends, had no wallet on him, no money, and no keys to his own home. He had been stripped, with the best of intentions or otherwise, of nearly everything a person would need to take care of themselves at 2 a.m. in a cold suburb far from home. Have you ever noticed how the most reasonable sounding decisions can, in hindsight, form the outline of a catastrophe? Every single choice that night seems to have a sensible explanation, and yet, stacked together, they built a trap that Henry never walked back out of. At around 1:40 in the morning, in those first dark hours of Monday, the 7th of September, Henry left the club. He did not leave with the whole group. He left with William Kennedy in Kennedy's car. Calvin Johnson, according to the accounts, still had Henry's wallet. Kennedy still had Henry's keys. And now Henry was in a vehicle with one man, heading out into the night. Here is where the first genuinely strange thing happens. Henry's apartment was not far from that club. We are talking about a distance of a little over 2 miles, a drive of just a few minutes. Kennedy, by his own account, was taking Henry home. And yet, Henry did not go home. According to what Kennedy told investigators, and according to a search warrant affidavit that was later referenced in reporting on the case, Henry asked to be dropped off somewhere else instead. He asked to be taken to a gas station. Now picture that request. A heavily intoxicated man, well past 2 a.m, with no wallet and no money and no keys, asks his friend to drop him not at his own front door, 2 miles away, but at a gas station. Why? What was at the gas station? What did he intend to do there, with no money in his pocket? Was he going to meet someone? Was he confused? Was he trying to get somewhere or away from something? We do not know. That is one of the first honest "we do not know" moments in this case, and it will not be the last. What we can say is that, according to Kennedy, that is what Henry wanted, and Kennedy obliged him. And this is where the timeline starts to break down, because the story Kennedy first told about that drop-off did not match what the cameras would later reveal. When Kennedy initially spoke to police, he told them that he had dropped Henry off at a Super America gas station in Fridley, a neighboring suburb. That was the account. That was the last known location, according to the man who was with him. Investigators went looking for evidence to confirm it. They went to that Super America, and here is the problem. They could not find any sign that Henry or Kennedy had ever been there. There was no surveillance footage placing them at that station. The account and the evidence simply did not line up. Let's sit with how significant that is. In a missing person case, the single most important piece of information is often the last confirmed location. It is the anchor for everything. It is where the search begins. And in the early days of this case, that anchor was wrong. The place investigators had been told to focus on was not where Henry had actually been. Time was lost. Attention was pointed in the wrong direction. And a family desperate for a starting point was working from a map that did not match the territory. It was not until surveillance footage was gathered from other locations that the truth of the drop-off emerged. According to reporting from local outlets and a public announcement by Henry's own family, new video showed that Henry had actually been dropped off at a different station entirely, not the Super America, but a holiday gas station located off Central Avenue and Hackman Avenue in Fridley, a different place, nearby, but not the same, and crucially, not the one that had first been described to police. Now, to be fair, and this is important, there is more than one way to read that discrepancy. It is entirely possible that Kennedy simply misspoke or misremembered. It was the middle of the night. People confuse gas stations. Two stations in the same general area, both in Fridley, could easily be mixed up by someone recalling a hazy, late-night drive days later. That is a genuinely reasonable explanation, and we should not pretend it is not. Kennedy was never charged with any crime in connection with Henry's disappearance or death. He was never publicly named as a suspect by police. Suspicion is not the same as evidence, and an inconsistent memory is not the same as a lie. We have to be honest about that, out of fairness to a living man who was never accused of anything by the authorities. But we also have to be honest about why that discrepancy troubled so many people, including Henry's family, because it was not the only thing that did not quite add up. Think about the whole shape of it. Two friends are so worried about Henry's level of intoxication that they take away his wallet and his keys to protect him. That is deep concern. That is the behavior of people who did not want him to come to harm. And yet, that same night, that same deeply intoxicated man, now with no money and no way into his home, is dropped off alone at a gas station in the dark, a few miles from his house, and simply left there. Those two things sit uneasily beside each other. If you were worried enough to take his keys, the question so many people have asked, including his wife, is why you were not worried enough to make sure he actually got inside his home. Have you ever wondered how often the truth of a night dies with the people who choose not to tell it? We are not saying that is what happened here. We genuinely do not know what happened here, but the frustration at the heart of this case from the very beginning is that the people who were with Henry in his last hours gave accounts that raised more questions than they answered, and that one of those accounts turned out not to match the footage. In a case with so few solid facts, that mismatch became one of the loudest things in the entire story. Let's pull back and look at what we can actually place on a map with confidence, because the physical evidence, unlike the human accounts, tells a cleaner story. Henry's cell phone was pinging off towers that night, and those pings placed him in the Spring Lake Park and Fridley areas in a way that is broadly consistent with a night out at that club and a drop-off at that station. The phone is a silent, honest witness. It does not misremember. And in the coming hours, that phone would do something that transformed this case from an ordinary missing person report into something that people are still trying to decipher years later. So here is where we stand at roughly 2 a.m. on Monday, the 7th of September, 2015. Henry McCabe, a 32-year-old auditor, a husband and father, deeply intoxicated by the accounts of his friends, has been dropped off alone at a holiday gas station in Fridley. He has no wallet. He has no money. He has no keys to his home, which is a couple of miles away. His family is in California. The night is cold and dark and quiet in the way that only the small hours of a Monday can be. His friend's car pulls away, and Henry McCabe walks off into the last hour of his life that anyone can account for. You're standing in that gas station parking lot in Fridley, In the earliest hours of that Monday morning, the fluorescent lights buzz overhead, throwing that flat, colorless glow over the empty pumps. There is almost no traffic on Central Avenue at this hour. The air has that late summer chill that tells you fall is coming. A man stands there, alone, watching a set of taillights disappear down the road. He has no money to buy anything inside. He has no way to call a cab that he could pay for. He is 2 miles from a locked front door he cannot open, and whatever he does next, whatever choice he makes, or whatever happens to him, there is no camera to follow him, no friend at his side, no record at all. He simply steps out of the light and into a darkness the rest of us have spent years trying to see into. What happened in the next hour is the central, aching unknown of this entire case. We do not have footage of it. We do not have a witness to it. We have only what came next. Because at some point after that car pulled away, Henry McCabe's phone came to life. And the call it made would become the last time anyone on this earth would ever hear his voice. Let's talk about the phone call. Sometime around 2:23 in the morning, by the timeline that was later pieced together, Henry McCabe's phone made a call. It rang through to his wife, Corinne, who was in California with their children. She has consistently stated that she was not in Minnesota that night, that she was across the country when her husband disappeared. And so, what she experienced from 2,000 miles away, holding a phone to her ear in the dark, listening to something she could not see and could not stop. By Corinne's account, and by the accounts of family members who would later describe the recording, the call did not sound like a normal conversation. It sounded, at first, like it might have been an accident, a pocket dial, a phone bumped or pressed by mistake, the kind of call we have all received and all made, where you hear muffled fabric and distant nothing, and you hang up and text the person to let them know their phone called you. But this was not that. Whatever was happening on the other end of that line was not the ordinary rustle of a pocket. What Corinne described hearing, in those roughly 2 minutes, was her husband, in what sounded like genuine distress, screaming, sounds she struggled to describe, and by her account, Henry seeming to say that he had been shot. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the case that has been sensationalized more than any other, and this channel is not going to do that. There are corners of the internet that have turned those 2 minutes of a frightened man's final recorded moments into entertainment, into something to be replayed for shock, into a puzzle to be solved for clicks. We are not going to treat it that way. What matters, what is true and human and important, is this. Someone who loved Henry McCabe answered the phone in the middle of the night and heard the person they loved sounding terrified, and there was absolutely nothing they could do about it. Whatever the sounds were, whatever their cause turns out to be, that is a real and terrible thing to have lived through. We should hold that with the seriousness it deserves. While that call was happening, Corinne tried to get help. According to the accounts, as she listened, she also attempted to reach Henry's brother, and it was through that second connection that the recording we now know about actually came to exist. Henry's brother did not answer in time. The call went to his voicemail, and that voicemail captured the final stretch of the audio, preserving roughly the last 2 minutes of whatever was happening to Henry McCabe. His brother, by his own account, did not even check his voicemail until the following day, and when he finally listened to it, when he heard what he described as the sound of his brother crying He understood immediately that something was terribly wrong. It was that brother who first raised the alarm, who first went to the police, who first said out loud that Henry was missing and that this was not normal. Think about that sequence for a moment. The most important piece of evidence in this entire case, the only direct record of Henry's final moments, existed because a call went unanswered and rolled to voicemail. If his brother had answered, there might have been a conversation, or there might have been nothing captured at all. Instead, a machine recorded 2 minutes of sound that no one heard until the next day, by which point Henry had already been missing for hours, his phone already dark. The one artifact we have is the product of a missed call. There is something almost unbearably sad in that. Help was being reached for. It simply arrived too late to be help at all. Now, what was actually on that recording? This is where we have to be extremely careful and extremely honest, because the truth is that no one outside a small circle can say with certainty. The audio has been described by family members. Portions of it have circulated, and the descriptions include screaming, distressed, and labored sounds, and what some listeners have characterized as strange, low, almost animal-like noises underneath the human ones. Some who have listened believe they can make out words. Some believe they can hear Henry say he was shot. Some believe they can even make out something that sounds like a name. Others listen to the very same recording and hear only the chaotic, garbled sound of a man in crisis, with no clear words at all, the audio too broken and too muddled to yield anything reliable. And here is the thing that we have to state plainly, because it cuts against a lot of the speculation. The authorities never publicly confirmed what was said on that recording. The Mounds View Police Department, with the help of the FBI and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, took that audio seriously. It was reportedly sent to the FBI in an effort to clean it up, to enhance it, to strip away the noise and hear whatever might be underneath. That is the work of a serious investigation. That is exactly what you would want them to do. But the results of that analysis were never released to the public in any detailed form, and no official ever came forward to say, with confidence, here is what Henry McCabe said in his final 2 minutes. To this day, the content of that recording remains officially unresolved. What people believe they hear on it says as much about the listener and about what they already suspect happened as it does about the audio itself. So we are left with competing interpretations, and it is worth walking through them honestly, because each one points toward a completely different version of that night. If Henry can truly be heard saying he was shot, then the recording sounds like evidence of an attack, of a violent encounter in the dark. If the low, strange sounds are something other than a human voice, people have asked whether an animal was involved, though that theory runs into an immediate problem we will come back to. And if the sounds are simply the noises of a person in severe physical distress, of someone struggling, of someone in the water, then the recording might be the sound of an accident unfolding rather than a crime. The exact same 2 minutes of audio can be heard as murder, as accident, or as something in between, depending entirely on what you bring to it. That ambiguity is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. To be fair to the people who suspect the worst, there is a reason the recording alone made this case feel like a homicide from the very start. A pocket dial is silent. A drunk man wandering home does not typically leave 2 minutes of screaming on his wife's phone. Whatever else you believe, something happened in those minutes that frightened Henry McCabe, or hurt him, or both. The recording is not neutral. It carries genuine fear in it, and that fear is why so many people have never been able to accept the simplest explanations. And to be fair to the people who suspect an accident, we have to remember one crucial fact, which we will examine much more closely later. When Henry McCabe's body was eventually found and examined, there were no gunshot wounds on it. None. Whatever he may or may not have said on that recording, the physical evidence did not show that he had been shot. That single fact hangs over the entire interpretation of the audio, because if he said he was shot and he was not shot, then either he was mistaken in a moment of terror and confusion, or the words people think they hear are not the words that were actually spoken. Both of those possibilities are unsettling in their own way. Let's talk about what the phone did next, because after that call, the physical trail goes almost completely silent. Henry's cell phone continued to ping for a short time, and those final pings placed him in a specific area. The last signals were traced to a cell tower in the vicinity of Creekview Park in New Brighton, Minnesota. That location matters enormously, and we will return to it because of where Henry's body would eventually be found. But then, shortly after the call, the phone went dead. It disconnected, and it was never turned on again. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. In an age where a phone is a beacon, a tracker, a lifeline that can be pinged and located and traced, Henry McCabe's phone simply went dark and stayed dark, as if it had been switched off, or destroyed, or dropped somewhere it could no longer reach a signal. That silence was total. Have you ever thought about what it means for a phone to go dark in the modern world? We carry these devices everywhere. They know where we are at almost every moment. For a person to vanish, truly vanish, in 2015, the phone has to stop. And Henry's did. From that moment, there was no digital trail to follow. No new pings, no texts, no calls, no logins, no activity of any kind. The most connected object in his life went quiet and took whatever it knew with it. By the time Henry's brother listened to that voicemail the next day and understood that something was wrong, hours had already passed. The alarm was raised, a missing person report was filed, and now the people who loved Henry had to confront the terrible arithmetic of a disappearance. Every hour that passes makes the trail colder. Every hour makes it less likely that the person is simply somewhere sleeping it off, and more likely that something has gone irreversibly wrong. Henry had not shown up for the job he never missed. There was no activity in his bank account. He had made no contact with anyone. For a reliable, family-oriented man to go completely silent was, in itself, a scream of its own kind. Which brings us to the response, and to a detail that made this case unusual from the start. When Henry's family began pushing for a real search, they did not only lean on the local police, they brought in an organization called Minnesota Community Policing Services, a non-profit led by a man named David Singleton, which stepped in to act as a kind of bridge between the family and law enforcement, and to advocate for a more aggressive investigation. That group would go on to supervise and direct search efforts for months, and it would become one of the loudest voices insisting that Henry's disappearance was suspicious and deserved far more scrutiny than it was getting. It is not common for a family to feel they need an outside advocate just to get their loved one's case taken seriously. That they felt that need tells you something about the frustration that defined this case from its earliest days. And so, in the days after the 7th of September, the search for Henry McCabe began in earnest. Volunteers gathered. His community, the close-knit Liberian-American community that knew him, turned out. His wife flew back and worked with investigators. His brother, who had heard those final 2 minutes, carried the weight of being the one who raised the alarm. And everyone involved was working from a starting point that, as we now know, was partly wrong, because the gas station they had first been told about was not the gas station where Henry had actually been. The question that hung over all of it was simple, and it has never gone away. Where did Henry McCabe go after that car pulled away? He was on foot, intoxicated, with no money and no keys, somewhere in the cold dark of Fridley and New Brighton. His phone had captured 2 minutes of terror and then gone silent forever. And between that gas station and wherever he ended up, there was nothing, no trail, no sighting, no answer. Let's talk about the search and about the investigation that tried and largely failed to fill in that terrible blank. The search for Henry McCabe unfolded across the northern suburbs of Minneapolis through the autumn of 2015, and it was defined more than anything by a lack of solid ground to stand on. When a person goes missing, investigators need an anchor, that reliable last known location we talked about earlier. And for the first stretch of this search, that anchor was in the wrong place. Remember, the initial account pointed to a Super America gas station. Searchers and investigators oriented themselves around that. But when the surveillance footage finally corrected the record, and it became clear Henry had been dropped at the holiday station off Central and Hackman instead, the whole geography of the search had to shift. Henry's own family announced the corrected location publicly and said they would refocus their efforts on that new area, working alongside the police and the community policing group. Imagine the emotional cost of that. You have spent precious days searching one area, only to learn you were looking in the wrong place from the start. In a case where every hour mattered, days were spent on a map that did not match reality. Once the search reoriented, attention turned to two things: the corrected drop-off point in Fridley and the location of those final cell phone pings near Creekview Park in New Brighton. And here investigators and volunteers focused heavily on the waterways, because this part of Minnesota is not just suburbs and roads. It is threaded through with lakes, ponds, creeks, and wetlands. Water is everywhere. And when a person's phone last pinged near a park full of water, and that person was intoxicated and disoriented in the dark, the water becomes an obvious and grim place to look. For weeks, volunteers came out, many of them every Saturday, walking the routes Henry might have taken if he had tried to get home on foot. They searched neighborhoods, parks, and shorelines. Law enforcement personnel worked alongside them. The Mounds View Police Department led the effort, later joined by New Brighton Police as the search area shifted into their jurisdiction. And critically, this was not a small local matter that stayed local. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the state's own investigative agency, provided support, and the FBI became involved as well, primarily in connection with that recording, that voicemail, working to enhance and analyze the audio that everyone hoped might hold the key. To be fair to the investigators, that is a serious response. State and federal agencies do not attach themselves to every missing person case. Their involvement tells you that the people working this case understood early on that it was unusual, that the voicemail made it something more than a routine disappearance. The police chief in the area at the time, a man named Kinney, spoke publicly about the case and was careful not to close off any possibility. He said, in essence, that they were not ruling anything out, not the possibility that Henry had disappeared on his own, not the possibility of an accident, and not the possibility that someone had intended to do him harm. That is an honest posture for an investigator to take when the facts are genuinely unclear. He also made a point of asking anyone who might have information they had been reluctant to share to come forward, saying investigators very much wanted to hear it. That is not the language of a case anyone considered simple, but honesty requires us to sit with the frustrations too, because the family and their advocates did not feel the investigation was aggressive enough, and they said so, loudly and repeatedly. David Singleton and the Minnesota Community Policing Services Group came to the conclusion early on that Henry's disappearance was highly suspicious, and they pushed for immediate and sustained search and rescue efforts. They supervised those efforts for months, and they raised pointed questions, the same questions many people watching this case from the outside were asking. Why had the people closest to Henry given accounts that did not fully hold together? Why had the first location been wrong? And why, if this was so clearly suspicious, did it feel to the family like the official investigation kept stalling out? Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be a family member in the middle of something like this? To be the ones organizing the volunteers, walking the shorelines yourselves, printing the flyers, making the calls, feeling as though if you stop pushing for even a moment, the whole thing will simply grind to a halt and your person will be forgotten. That is the position Henry's family found themselves in. They were not passive recipients of an investigation. They were, in many ways, driving it. And that is a heavy thing to have to do, while you are also grieving and terrified and hoping against the odds that the person you love is somehow still alive out there. For nearly 2 months, that hope had nowhere to land. The searches, in the words of the officials, turned up nothing of any significance, no confirmed sightings, no clear trail from the gas station to anywhere. The routes Henry might have walked led searchers to no answers. It was as if he had stepped out of that parking lot and evaporated, and with each passing week, the terrible probability grew. A reliable man does not stay silent for 2 months. His bank account does not stay untouched. His phone does not stay dark. Everyone involved understood, even if no one wanted to say it, what a 2-month silence almost certainly meant. And then, on the 2nd of November, 2015, the search ended the way so many of these searches tragically end, with water. A kayaker was out on Rush Lake in New Brighton on that November day. Rush Lake sits in that same area where Henry's phone had made its final pings, near the network of parks and water that searchers had focused on. And out on the water, the kayaker came upon a body. Authorities were called. The body was recovered, and after a process of identification that took several days, it was confirmed to be Henry McCabe. He had been found roughly 6 miles from where he was last seen alive. Let that distance settle for a moment, because it is one of the central puzzles of this whole case. Depending on how you measure it, from the gas station where he was dropped off to the lake where he was found, is a walk of somewhere around 6 to 7 miles. That is not a short stumble. That is not a confused man wandering a block and falling into the nearest pond. That is hours of walking in the cold, in the dark, deeply intoxicated, with no money and no phone signal after a certain point, ending at a lake. Could a person in Henry's condition have covered that distance on foot? Some believe it is possible. Others find it very hard to accept. That distance is one of the reasons the simplest explanation has never fully satisfied the people who have studied this case. A drunk man drowns in the nearest water. He does not typically drown in a lake 7 miles away after an epic overnight march. And yet, there he was. The discovery of Henry's body answered the most agonizing question, whether he was alive or dead, in the worst possible way. But it did not answer the questions that mattered most for understanding what had happened. In fact, in some ways, it deepened them, because the medical examination that followed produced findings that fit neatly with none of the theories, and that complicated all of them. The autopsy was performed by the Ramsey County Medical Examiner's Office, and it was, by all accounts, a difficult examination, because Henry's body had been in the water for roughly 2 months. Advanced decomposition makes forensic work harder. It can erase or obscure the very signs that investigators most need to find. So we have to hold the findings with that limitation in mind. But here is what the medical examiner determined, and here is what they could not determine. The cause of death was listed as drowning. That was the finding. Henry McCabe drowned. His lungs, his body, told the story of a man who had died in the water, and critically, the examination found no gunshot wounds. None. Despite the fact that some people believed they heard Henry say on that recording that he had been shot, his body bore no evidence of any gunshot at all. There were also, according to the findings, no obvious signs of trauma, no clear physical evidence of a struggle or an assault that the examiner could point to and say, this is how he was harmed by another person. And yet, and this is the crucial part, the manner of death was not determined. Now, cause of death and manner of death are two different things, and the difference is everything in a case like this. The cause of death is the medical mechanism, drowning. The manner of death is the circumstance. Was it an accident, a homicide, or a suicide? And on that question, the medical examiner did not or could not render a conclusion. The manner was left undetermined, which means that officially the state of Minnesota has never declared whether Henry McCabe's death was an accident, a crime, or a choice. The single document that might have settled the argument simply declined to settle it. Think about what that leaves us with. A man drowns in a lake 7 miles from where he was last seen. He was not shot. Despite what some hear on the recording, he shows no clear signs of having been beaten or attacked, but the manner of his death cannot be determined, because the plain fact of drowning does not tell you how he got into that water, or why, or whether anyone else was involved. Drowning is the great forensic ambiguity. It can be a terrible accident. It can be the end of a homicide if someone put him there or drove him there. It can be a suicide. The water does not testify, it only takes. There is also the matter of toxicology. According to reporting on the case, toxicology testing was said to have been performed. Given the accounts of heavy drinking that night, and the questions some have raised about whether Henry might have been drugged, those results could have been genuinely illuminating. But like so much else in this investigation, detailed toxicology findings were not released publicly in a way that resolved anything. So even the question of exactly what was in Henry's system and whether it points towards simple intoxication or something more sinister, sits in the same fog as the rest of it. The officials involved continued to speak carefully. A police chief named Jacobson, whose department was involved as the case moved into New Brighton's jurisdiction, said that everyone was committed to a thorough and professional investigation to determine the cause and manner of Henry's death and what had happened to him. He said they did not want to leave any stone unturned, and I want to be fair here. I do not think those were empty words. I think the investigators involved genuinely wanted answers. But wanting answers and being able to reach them are two very different things, and the physical evidence in this case was, from the start, agonizingly thin. A decomposed body, a dark phone, a muddled recording that even the FBI could not turn into a clear statement of fact, a last known location that had to be corrected, and a set of human accounts that raised suspicion, but never rose to proof. Which brings us to the hardest truth about the investigation into Henry McCabe's death. It did not fail because no one cared. It did not fail because no one tried. State and federal agencies were involved. His family and community pushed relentlessly. Searches went on for months. The recording was sent for expert analysis. And still, at the end of all of it, the case stood almost exactly where it began. Open, unresolved. A cause of death, but no manner of death. A last phone call, but no explanation of it. A body, but no story of how it came to be in that lake. And this is where the case stops being about evidence and starts being about interpretation. Because when the facts run out, the theories begin. And the Henry McCabe case has generated no shortage of theories, ranging from the tragically simple to the deeply sinister to, unfortunately, the frankly exploitative. So let's walk through them, one at a time, as fairly and as carefully as we can, always keeping in mind the difference between what we know and what we are only guessing. Let's talk about the theories. Before we go through these, I want to set one ground rule for this section, because it matters more here than anywhere else. Everything we are about to discuss is theory. Not one of these explanations has been proven. No one has ever been charged with a crime in connection with Henry McCabe's death. The people who were with him that night are, in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of basic fairness, innocent, because they were never shown to be anything else. When we walk through the possibilities, we are not accusing anyone. We are laying out the range of things that could explain what happened, and we are trying to be honest about the strengths and weaknesses of each. Please hold that in your mind. It is easy, with a case this haunting, to let suspicion harden into certainty. We are not going to do that. Let's start with the explanation that is, in some ways, the simplest, and that fits the official medical finding most directly: the theory of accidental drowning. The version goes like this. Henry was extremely intoxicated. By the accounts of the friends who were with him, he was dropped off at a gas station in the middle of the night, with no phone signal to guide him after a certain point, no money, and no keys to get into his home. Disoriented, confused, and impaired, he set off on foot, and somewhere in the dark, in a landscape full of water, he ended up at Rush Lake, went into the water, and drowned. The strange voicemail in this reading is not the sound of an attack at all. It is the sound of a man in severe distress, possibly already in trouble, possibly already in the water, his cries and struggles captured by a phone that dialed out by accident. The animal-like sounds some people describe become, in this theory, the raw and terrible sounds of a person drowning, sounds we are simply not used to hearing and struggle to identify. What is the evidence for this theory? Quite a lot, actually. The cause of death was drowning. There were no gunshot wounds despite what some believe they hear on the recording. There were no clear signs of a struggle or an assault. Henry was, by multiple accounts, heavily intoxicated, and in a region as saturated with lakes and ponds as that part of Minnesota, an impaired person wandering in the dark ending up in the water is tragically not far-fetched. It happens. It happens more often than people realize. This explanation requires no villain, no conspiracy, no cover-up. It requires only alcohol, cold, darkness, and terrible luck. But there are real problems with it, and they are the reasons this theory has never fully closed the case. The first is the distance. As we said, the walk from that gas station to Rush Lake is somewhere around 6 or 7 miles. That is a very long way for a severely intoxicated man to travel on foot in the dead of night without being seen by anyone, without turning up on any camera, without leaving any trace along the route. Searchers walked those possible paths and found nothing. The second problem is the voicemail itself. Even if we accept that the sounds could be a drowning rather than an attack, there is the reported content, the sense that Henry was frightened, the possibility that he said he had been shot. Fear like that is not the usual texture of a simple accident. And the third problem is everything about how the night was set up. The wallet taken, the keys taken, the odd request for a gas station, the wrong station given to police at first. None of those things prove foul play, but they make the accident theory feel incomplete, as though it explains the ending without explaining the road that led there. Which brings us to the theory that many people, including some of Henry's own family and advocates, have leaned toward from the beginning. The theory of foul play. Now picture the case through this lens. A man is deliberately separated from his money and his keys. He is driven not home, but to a gas station and left there alone. The account of where that happened is initially given incorrectly, and only the cameras set it straight. Then, within the hour, that man's phone captures 2 minutes of what sounds like genuine terror, possibly the sound of him being harmed, before going permanently dark. His body turns up 7 miles away, in a lake, months later. In this reading, Henry McCabe did not wander off and drown by accident. Something was done to him. Someone, somewhere in that missing hour, harmed him or frightened him or drove him to that water, and the truth of it has been withheld ever since. The evidence offered for this theory is mostly circumstantial, but it is not nothing. The voicemail is the centerpiece. To many ears, it does not sound like an accident. It sounds like fear. The inconsistencies in the accounts of that night trouble people deeply. The corrected gas station location, in particular, has never fully been explained to everyone's satisfaction, even if an innocent explanation is entirely possible. The advocates from the community policing group pointed repeatedly to what they described as withheld or manipulated information, and asked pointedly why an accidental death would be surrounded by so many inconsistencies. And there is the sheer strangeness of the whole shape of the night, the way each individually reasonable decision added up to leaving a vulnerable man alone and stranded in the dark. But we have to be just as honest about the problems with the foul play theory, because they are significant. The most important one is the body itself. If Henry was the victim of a violent attack, the physical evidence did not clearly show it. No gunshot wounds, no clear signs of a beating or a struggle. The that the medical examiner could identify, though we have to remember that months in the water can erase such signs. More than that, in all the years since, with the FBI and the state's own investigative bureau involved, no one has ever been charged. No suspect has ever been publicly named by the authorities. If there was a crime, it has left no provable perpetrator, no confession, no piece of physical evidence strong enough to bring a case. Suspicion, however deeply felt, is not proof. And the people whom online speculation has circled for years have never been shown by any court or any investigation to have done anything wrong. It would be a genuine injustice to treat them as guilty simply because the case is unsolved, and the human mind hates an unsolved case. There is a middle theory, one that tries to bridge the gap between accident and crime, and it is one of the more compelling ones. It is the theory that Henry was drugged. Here is the idea. What if, at some point that night, Henry ingested something, whether by his own hand or someone else's, that sent him into a state of severe disorientation, panic, or hallucination? That single possibility could tie together the two loose threads that neither the pure accident theory nor the pure homicide theory handles well. It could explain the bizarre, frightening quality of the voicemail. A man in the grip of a frightening, altered state, genuinely believing he was under attack, genuinely screaming for his life, even if no attacker was physically present. And it could explain how a person might end up walking miles into the dark and into a lake, not through ordinary drunken clumsiness, but through a chemically induced break from reality. In this reading, Henry's death is still, technically, a drowning, but the road to it runs through something that was done to him, or that he took, something that turned an ordinary night into a nightmare inside his own mind. The appeal of this theory is that it makes the voicemail make sense in a way the others struggle to. But its weakness is the same weakness that haunts everything else in this case. We cannot confirm it. The toxicology results that might have supported or demolished it were never released publicly in any conclusive form. So the drugging theory remains exactly that, a theory, an intriguing possible bridge between accident and crime, floating on the same lack of hard evidence as everything around it. We should also, briefly and respectfully, acknowledge that the possibility of suicide has been raised. It has to be mentioned, because the manner of death was left undetermined, which means the medical examiner did not rule it out, and because some reports over the years pointed to personal stresses in Henry's life around that time. I want to be very careful and very fair here. Those reported stresses are not well established, they are contested, and they come to us secondhand. Henry's family and advocates have strongly rejected the idea that his death was anything other than suspicious, and they have every right to. And the suicide theory runs hard into the same wall as the accident theory. The voicemail does not sound like a man who has made a peaceful, private decision. It sounds like fear and chaos. So while intellectual honesty requires us to note that this possibility exists on the official table, precisely because nothing was ruled in or out, it is not a theory that fits comfortably with the one piece of direct evidence we actually have. We mention it, we do not dwell on it, and we extend to Henry and his family the dignity of not pretending we know his inner state in his final hours. We do not. And then there is the fringe, because a case like this, with a strange recording at its heart, inevitably attracts explanations that abandon evidence altogether. Over the years, The Henry McCabe voicemail has been passed around parts of the internet with labels like eerie or unexplained or even supernatural, with people insisting the sounds on it are not human, that they represent something otherworldly, something paranormal. I want to address this directly and then set it aside, because it does a real disservice to a real man and his real family. There is no evidence of anything supernatural in Henry McCabe's death. The idea that the sounds might be an animal has a simple problem, which is that the area where his body was found is not the kind of wild forest where you would expect a bear or a wolf, and the leap from a muddled, distressing recording to the paranormal is not a leap of investigation. It is a leap away from the human tragedy at the center of this, toward entertainment. Henry was a father and a husband who died frightened and alone. He was not a ghost story. Turning his final 2 minutes into a piece of spooky internet content is one of the quieter cruelties this case has suffered, and we are not going to participate in it. So where does that leave us after walking through all of it? It leaves us with a genuinely, honestly unsolved case. The accident theory fits the medical findings, but struggles with the distance and the fear on the recording. The foul play theory fits the fear and the inconsistencies, but has never produced a shred of provable evidence or a single charge. The drugging theory bridges the two but cannot be confirmed. The suicide theory sits on the table only because the manner of death was undetermined and fits the evidence poorly. And the supernatural talk is not a theory at all, just a way of looking away from something sad and hard. Have you ever wondered whether some cases are unsolved, not because the answer is exotic, but because the truth is simply unrecoverable? Because the one person who knew what happened is gone, and the few who might know something are silent, and the physical world washed the evidence away in 2 months of cold lake water. That may be the most honest thing we can say about Henry McCabe. Not that the answer is strange, but that it may be permanently out of reach. And that is its own kind of heartbreak, separate from grief. It is the heartbreak of never knowing. Let's talk about what happened after. About the family Henry left behind, about the community that refused to forget him, and about where this case actually stands today. Everything in this case orbits around a single, terrible gap, a stretch of time less than an hour, between the moment a car pulled away from a gas station in Fridley and the moment a phone captured 2 minutes of sound and then went dark forever. Nobody living can account for that hour. There is no footage of it. There is no witness to it. And yet it contains the entire answer. So let's do the one thing we can do. Let's walk the ground. You're standing at the Holiday gas station off Central Avenue in Fridley in the earliest hours of a Monday morning in September. This is real geography. These are real streets in the real northern suburbs of the Twin Cities, a landscape most people drive through without ever really seeing. Central Avenue is a wide commercial road, the kind lined with car dealerships and fast food and the low glow of signs that never turn off. At this hour, though, it is nearly empty. The traffic that clogs it by day has thinned to the occasional pair of headlights sweeping past, and standing in that parking lot, a man is deciding, or being forced to decide, where to go. Henry McCabe's home in Mounds View was a couple of miles from where the night began, back near the club in Spring Lake Park. But he was not dropped there. He was here, in Fridley, at a station he had reportedly asked to be taken to. From here, the geography of what came next stretches out to the north and east into New Brighton, where his phone would make its final pings near Creekview Park and where, eventually, his body would be found in Rush Lake. When you lay it all out on a map, the pieces form a rough path across a few adjacent suburbs. But a path on a map is a clean, simple line. A path on foot, in the dark, drunk, cold, and afraid, is something else entirely. Now picture trying to make that journey. It is the middle of the night. The temperature has dropped into that early autumn chill that cuts through you once the sun is long gone. You have no phone signal to guide you after a certain point, and eventually no working phone at all. You have no money, so you cannot stop anywhere, cannot buy warmth or a ride or a moment of shelter. Around you, the suburbs are asleep. Dark houses, empty parking lots, the occasional streetlight throwing a cone of light onto empty pavement, and between those cones, long stretches of shadow. This is not a wilderness. It is something almost stranger. It is a populated place, full of people, in which you are utterly alone, because every one of those people is behind a locked door, asleep, unaware that anyone is out there at all. The distance from that gas station to Rush Lake, where Henry was found, is somewhere in the range of 6 to 7 miles by most reckonings. Try to hold what that actually means in your body. On a clear day, well rested and sober, a healthy person walks a mile in 15 or 20 minutes. 6 or 7 miles is a walk of nearly 2 hours at a steady pace. Now strip away the daylight, strip away the sobriety, strip away the sense of direction that a phone map provides, add fear and cold and confusion. That walk stops being a simple matter of putting one foot in front of the other. It becomes an ordeal. And the honest question that has divided everyone who has looked at this case is whether a man in Henry's condition could have made that journey at all, on his own, unaided, unseen. Some say yes. Alcohol and fear can drive a person to do extraordinary and irrational things, to keep moving long past the point where it makes any sense, to walk for miles in the wrong direction, chasing some half-formed idea of home or help or escape. Disoriented people have been found astonishing distances from where they went missing. It happens. And if Henry was in the grip of panic or something worse, the ordinary limits might not apply. Others say no, or at least not likely, because that walk should have left traces. It should have crossed paths with a camera, a passing car, an early shift worker, a dog walker, something. Searchers went looking along exactly those possible routes and found nothing of significance. A 7-mile overnight journey by a man in visible distress, leaving no confirmed sighting and no physical trail anywhere along the way, strikes many people as difficult to accept. And if he did not walk there under his own power, then the alternative is that he got there some other way, and every other way involves another person. This is the quiet horror of the missing hour. Both readings are unsettling. Either Henry McCabe, alone and terrified, made an impossible-feeling march through sleeping suburbs to die in a cold lake and simply happened to leave no trace. Or he did not make it alone, and someone helped put him where he was found and has never answered for it. There is no comfortable version. There is no reading of that missing hour that lets you set the case down and feel at peace with it. That is part of why it lingers. And then there are the phone pings, which are the closest thing we have to a witness to that hour, and which point us toward New Brighton, toward Creekview Park. That is where the signal placed Henry near the end. Now think about what a cell phone ping actually is, because people often misunderstand it. It does not pin a person to a spot the way a movie makes it seem. It tells you which tower the phone connected to, which places the phone somewhere within that tower's range. It is a neighborhood, not an address, but it is something. It says Henry, or at least Henry's phone, was in that vicinity, near that park, near that water, as the night reached its end, and that vicinity is consistent with where he was ultimately found. The phone, the silent, honest witness, drew a rough arrow pointing at the water, and then it went dark and stopped telling us anything at all. Have you ever stood at the edge of a lake at night? There is a particular quality to it. The water goes black and still, and it swallows sound, and it stretches out into a darkness you cannot see the far side of. In daylight, a suburban lake is a pleasant thing, a place for kayakers and fishermen and families. At night, in the cold, to a person alone and in trouble, it is something else. It is a boundary, an ending, and somewhere out on that black water, on a September night, Henry McCabe's story reached its final page, in a place no one saw, at a time no one can fix, for reasons no one has ever been able to prove. We cannot walk that missing hour all the way through, no matter how carefully we try. It resists us at every step. But standing here, on the real ground, looking at the real distance between where he was left and where he was found, you come to understand why this case will not let people go. The gap is not just a gap in the evidence. It is a gap you can feel. It is the shape of a man walking out of the light, and everyone who cares about him standing on the other side of that darkness, calling his name and never getting an answer. Let's talk about the questions that have never gone away. Some cases are unsolved because there are no clues. Henry McCabe's case is the opposite kind. It is unsolved despite a whole cluster of clues, each one of which seems like it should lead somewhere, and none of which ever quite does. So let's take the biggest of those loose threads and pull on each one honestly to see why none of them has ever closed the loop. Start with the recording because it is the thread everyone reaches for first. That voicemail was sent to the FBI. Think about what that means. The most sophisticated audio analysis resources in the country were, at least reportedly, brought to bear on those 2 minutes of sound. The goal was to clean it up, to lift the human voice out of the noise, to determine what, if anything, Henry was actually saying. And then, silence. The findings of that analysis were never released publicly in any detailed, conclusive form. No official statement of here is what the recording contains, no clarification of the disputed words, nothing. Now, that silence can be read two ways, and honesty demands we hold both. One reading is that the analysis simply did not yield anything usable, that the audio was too degraded, too chaotic, too broken to produce a reliable transcript, and that the FBI, unable to say anything definitive, said nothing at all. That is entirely plausible. Enhancement is not magic, and sometimes the noise simply wins. The other reading, the one that gnaws at the family and the online followers of this case, is that investigators learned something they chose not to share, whether to protect an ongoing investigation or for reasons of their own. We cannot know which it is, but either way, the effect is the same. The single most important piece of evidence in the entire case was examined by the best in the business, and the public was never told what they found. In a case defined by a recording, the official verdict on that recording is a blank. Then there is the thread of the accounts given by the people who were with Henry that night. And here we have to be careful and fair all over again. We have already talked about the wallet, the keys, the request for a gas station, and the initial description of the wrong station. Each of those, individually, has an innocent explanation. Friends do take keys from drunk friends. People do misremember which gas station they stopped at. A drunk man might well ask to be dropped somewhere other than home for a reason that made sense only to him. None of it is proof of anything. And the man who gave that corrected account, William Kennedy, was never charged, never publicly named as a suspect by police, and is entitled to the full presumption of innocence, which we extend to him without reservation. But you can understand, can't you, why the family could not simply let it go? Because in a case with almost no hard evidence, the human accounts carry more weight than they otherwise would. And those accounts left the family with a feeling, not a fact, but a feeling that they were not getting the whole story. Henry's wife openly wondered why, if his friends were worried enough to take his keys, they were not worried enough to see him safely through his own front door. That is not an unreasonable question. It is, in fact, the most natural question in the world, and the fact that it has never been answered to her satisfaction is part of what has kept this wound open for so many years. The family's advocates went further. David Singleton and the community policing group that worked the case did not just express vague unease. They publicly characterized the situation as one involving withheld information, inconsistent statements, and what they described as obstruction of their efforts to investigate independently. Those are strong words, and we have to present them the way they should be presented, as the stated view of the family's advocates, not as established fact. No obstruction was ever proven in court. No one was ever charged with impeding the investigation. But the fact that the people closest to the search came away describing it in those terms tells you how deeply the sense of something not right ran. This was not a family that felt reassured by the process. This was a family that felt they were fighting the current the entire way. There is also the tangled matter of the reward, which became its own small window into how chaotic the information around this case became. A reward was offered for information leading to answers in Henry's death, but even that simple thing did not stay simple. The amount has been reported differently at different times and in different places, and the relationship between the family, their advocates, and the wider public was not always smooth or aligned. In a case this starved of solid facts, the vacuum filled with speculation, with rumor, with competing versions pushed by people who often had never met Henry at all. And not all of that speculation was fair to the people it landed on. That is one of the ugly features of an unsolved case in the internet age. When the facts run out, strangers supply their own, and real people, grieving people, get caught in the crossfire of theories built by others for their own reasons. And then there is the forensic reality, which is maybe the most frustrating thread of all, because it is nobody's fault. Henry's body was in the water for roughly 2 months before it was found. 2 months. Water and time and cold are merciless to physical evidence. The signs that a forensic examiner most needs to find, the subtle marks of a struggle, the small injuries that distinguish an accident from an attack, the trace evidence that might point to another person, all of it degrades and vanishes in conditions like that. This is why the manner of death could be left undetermined even after a full examination. It is not that the medical examiner was careless. It is that the evidence they needed may simply have ceased to exist somewhere out in Rush Lake, dissolved by the same water that took Henry's life. Have you ever wondered how many cases go unsolved, not because the truth was hidden by a clever criminal, but because time and nature quietly erased it? Drowning cases are notoriously among the hardest to classify. Water does not preserve a crime scene. It disperses it. It carries things away. And a body recovered after months in a lake presents a medical examiner with a puzzle that is often, through no one's failing, simply unsolvable. Henry McCabe's case sits squarely in that hard category. The very manner of his death, the fact of drowning, is also the thing that made the truth so difficult to recover. So we have a recording the FBI analyzed but never explained. Accounts that raise suspicion but never rose to proof, given by people who are never charged and deserve the presumption of innocence. Advocates who described obstruction that was never established in court, a reward and a public conversation that grew tangled and sometimes unfair, and a body whose most important secrets may have washed away before anyone ever found it. Pull on any one of those threads and it comes loose in your hand without ever leading you to the center. That is the anatomy of a case that stays open for a decade. Not one missing piece, but a dozen pieces that almost fit and never quite do. And underneath all of it, the whole time, there is a family waiting. Let's talk about them and about what the years since have looked like from the inside of this loss. When a case goes cold, the headlines move on. The volunteers eventually go home. The reporters find new stories. But for a family, nothing moves on at all. The loss does not become historical. It stays present tense. And for the people who loved Henry McCabe, the years since that September night have been a long exercise in living inside a question that never gets answered. Think first about his children. In the fall of 2015, they were young. One of them was still practically a baby. The other was old enough to understand, in whatever way a child that age can understand, that their father had gone out one night and never came home. In the years since, those children have grown up. They have had birthdays and school years and all the ordinary milestones of childhood, every one of them shadowed by an absence, a father who is not there to see it, and not just gone, but gone into a mystery, so that even the small mercy of a clear story, a place to put the grief, was denied them. They have had to grow up not only without their father, but without an answer to the most basic question a grieving child can ask. What happened to my dad? To this day, no one has been able to give them a full answer. That is the human cost that sits underneath every theory and every timeline. Two kids who lost their father to a darkness no one could explain. Think about Kareen, his wife of roughly 11 years, who answered a phone in California in the middle of the night and heard something no spouse should ever have to hear, and then spent months and then years trying to get the world to take her husband's case seriously. Whatever else is true or unknown in this story, that experience is real and it is brutal. To lose your partner is one thing. To lose them into an unsolved case, to become a person who has to keep fighting, keep advocating, keep pushing against what she felt was a stalling investigation, all while raising children and carrying grief, is a burden most of us will never have to imagine. She flew back. She worked with investigators. She stood beside advocates and asked the hard questions publicly. She did what a person does when the system does not move fast enough and the person you love is out there somewhere in the cold. And think about Henry's brother, the one whose unanswered phone became the reason we have any recording at all. He carried a specific and unusual weight. He was the one who listened to that voicemail the next day and knew in his gut that his brother was in trouble. He was the one who first went to the police. In a sense, he heard Henry's final moments before he even knew they were final, and then had to live the rest of his life with that sound in his memory. There is no manual for that kind of grief. There is no getting over the last thing you heard from someone you loved being 2 minutes of terror on a machine. Around that immediate family stood the wider community, and this is one of the genuinely moving parts of the story. Henry was part of Minnesota's large Liberian American community, and that community did not let him become a forgotten name. They turned out for searches. They kept his case alive in conversation. They refused to let the world treat his disappearance as unremarkable. In a country where cases involving Black victims, and especially Black immigrant victims, too often receive less attention and less urgency than others, the persistence of Henry's community and his family was, in part, a refusal to accept that silence. They understood that if they did not keep his name in the light, no one else necessarily would. And so they did. The case did eventually draw national attention of a kind. In January of 2021, a television episode focused on Henry's disappearance and death aired on Investigation Discovery under a title that captured the suspicion so many people felt about the case, asking who wanted him dead. That kind of coverage matters. It brings new eyes. It carries the story to people who might know something or who might simply refuse to let it fade. For a family fighting the slow gravity of a cold case, every renewed piece of attention is a small victory against forgetting. But there is a darker side to the way this case has lived on, and we have to be honest about it because it speaks to something larger than Henry alone. Over the years, that voicemail, those 2 minutes of a frightened man's final recorded moments, has been passed around the internet as a curiosity, as content. It has been posted and reposted, dissected in comment sections, labeled with words like eerie and creepy and unexplained, played over dramatic music, turned into the kind of thing people click on for a shiver before scrolling to the next thing. Some of it has drifted into outright exploitation, framing a real man's death as a paranormal mystery, as entertainment, as a spooky sound to be consumed. I want to name that clearly because this channel exists in part as a refusal of it. Henry McCabe was not a sound effect. He was not a horror story. He was a father driving home the ordinary rhythms of an ordinary life who died frightened and alone and whose family still does not know why. The recording that some people treat as a novelty is to the people who loved him, the sound of the last moments of a human being they will never get back. There is a way to talk about difficult cases that keeps the person at the center, and there is a way that turns them into a product. The difference matters. It matters to the family, and it should matter to all of us because how we treat the dead and the grieving says everything about who we are. Where does the case stand today? The honest answer is that it stands almost exactly where it stood after that autopsy came back. The cause of death is drowning. The manner of death remains undetermined. No one has ever been arrested. No one has ever been charged. More than a decade has passed, and the central questions, what happened in that missing hour, what those 2 minutes of sound actually were, how a man came to drown in a lake 7 miles from where he was last seen, all remain open. The case has never been officially closed. but it has also never been solved. It exists in that terrible in-between, where a family is denied both resolution and the finality that would at least let them grieve without also having to investigate. Law enforcement has, over the years, continued to say that they welcome any information, that anyone who knows something, who saw something, who has been carrying something they have been afraid or reluctant to share, can come forward, because that is realistically the only way a case like this breaks now, not through new forensics most likely, since the physical evidence washed away long ago, but through a person, through someone who knows something they have never told, finally deciding to tell it. Cases like this have been cracked open years, even decades later, by exactly that. A conscience that finally speaks, a silence that finally ends. Have you ever wondered how many unsolved cases are sitting one honest conversation away from an answer? How many are held shut not by the absence of the truth, but by the presence of someone who knows it and has chosen not to say? We do not know if that is the situation with Henry McCabe. It may be that no living person holds the missing piece, that the truth genuinely died with him in that water. But if someone out there does know something, then Henry's story is not really unsolvable. It is only unspoken. And there is a profound difference between those two things. Let's bring this back one last time to the person at the center of all of it. Because after the timeline and the theories and the questions, after all the ways this case refuses to resolve, what remains, what should remain, is not the mystery. It is the man. There's something about this case that reaches beyond its own facts, something that explains why it has stayed with so many people who have no connection to Henry at all. And it has to do with the nature of what he left behind. Because Henry McCabe did not vanish in a wilderness, in some remote place beyond the reach of the modern world. He vanished in the middle of it, in a populated suburb, on a lit commercial road, surrounded by houses full of sleeping people, in a country blanketed with cameras and cell towers and the constant hum of digital connection. And still, he slipped through all of it. That is the quiet, unsettling heart of this story. We live now inside a kind of promise. The promise of our devices is that we are never truly alone, never truly untraceable, never truly lost. Our phones know where we are. Our steps are counted. Our faces are captured by cameras we never even notice. We have built a world that records almost everything on the unspoken assumption that all this recording keeps us safe, that if something ever happened to us, the digital exhaust of our lives would light up a clear trail for someone to follow. Henry McCabe's case is a hole in that promise, because when it mattered most, all that recording captured only fragments, a surveillance clip of a drop-off, a scatter of cell tower pings, and 2 minutes of sound. The systems logged his presence, and then they logged his absence. But the passage between the two, the part that actually mattered, went completely uncaptured. He was there, and then he was not. And the machines that were supposed to see everything saw nothing of the moment that counted. That is what a last phone call really is. It is not a clue in the way a fingerprint or a witness is a clue. It is a boundary marker. It is the final point at which a person was still reachable, still present, still part of the connected world before they crossed over into the silence. For most of human history, the last trace of a missing person was a physical thing, a footprint, a discarded belonging, a place where the trail simply stopped. Now, more and more, the last trace is a transmission, a text, a location ping, a voicemail, a recording. And there's something uniquely haunting about that, because a recording carries the person's actual voice. It is not a cold clue. It is them. It is the closest thing we have to reaching back through time and touching the moment itself. And yet, cruelly, it tells us so little. We can hear Henry and still not know what was happening to him. We can have his literal voice and still not have the truth. Have you ever thought about what your own last transmission would say about you? Most of ours would be mundane. A text about picking up groceries, a half-finished email, a location shared with a friend. We never think of these small digital acts as potential final words because we always assume there will be more of them. That is the assumption Henry made too, when he went out on an ordinary Sunday night. He had no reason to think that a pocket-dialed call would become the thing his family replayed for years, the thing strangers on the internet argued over, the last of him that anyone would ever have. None of us do. And that is precisely why cases like his unsettle us so deeply, because we recognize ourselves in them. We recognize the ordinariness. We understand, in some quiet and frightened place, that the line between a normal night and a permanent mystery can be as thin as a car door closing and a set of taillights pulling away. Now, picture the universality of the specific moment at the center of this. A person at the end of a night out gets dropped off. That is all. It is one of the most common events in modern life. It happens 1,000,000 times a weekend. A friend pulls up, you climb out, you say goodnight. The car drives off, and you head inside. We do it without a second thought. We have all been the one dropped off, and we have all been the one driving away. And almost every single time, nothing happens. The person gets inside. The night ends. The story is forgotten because there is no story. Henry McCabe's case is the vanishingly rare version where that ordinary moment became the last one anyone could account for, where the car drove off and the person did not go inside, did not get home, did not have an ordinary ending. It is horrifying precisely because of how familiar the setup is. There is no exotic danger in it. There is just a man alone at the edge of the light, at the end of a night that should have ended like every other. This is why we tell these stories carefully and why we resist the urge to turn them into thrills. The value in sitting with a case like Henry's is not the shiver of the strange voicemail. It is the recognition. It is the reminder to look out for one another a little more closely, to not leave the drunk friend at the gas station, but to walk them to the door, to check on the person who has gone quiet, to take seriously the small alarm bells that a reliable person has suddenly gone silent. Almost every one of these cases contains, somewhere in its timeline, a moment where a small act of care might have changed everything. We cannot go back and change Henry's night, but we can let his story sharpen our attention to the people at the edges of our own, and we can refuse to let him be reduced to the sound he left behind, because a person is so much more than their final transmission. Henry McCabe was not 2 minutes of audio. He was 30-some years of life. He was all the days before that night, the ordinary, unrecorded, irreplaceable days that made up an actual human being. The recording is the part the world kept, but it is the smallest and least representative part of who he was. If we let it become the whole of how he is remembered, we hand the last word to the worst moment of his life, and he deserves better than that. Everyone does. So let's give the last word back to Henry. Let's talk, finally, not about how he was lost, but about who he was. Here is where the case stands, stated plainly and without embellishment, because Henry's family deserves clarity even where the world could not give them answers. On an early September night in 2015, Henry McCabe left a night out with acquaintances, was dropped off alone at a gas station in Fridley, Minnesota, and made a phone call that captured roughly 2 minutes of distress before his phone went dark for good. Nearly 2 months later, a kayaker found his body in Rush Lake, several miles away. His cause of death was drowning. The manner of his death, whether accident or crime or something else, has never been determined. No one has ever been arrested. No one has ever been charged. More than a decade on, the case remains open and unsolved and quiet. But behind the case file, underneath the timeline and the theories and the endlessly replayed recording, was a real person. Henry Toby McCabe was a husband who had built 11 years of marriage. He was a father of 2 children who needed him and who have had to grow up without him. He was an auditor who was good at his careful, unglamorous work and who did not miss days at a job he was proud of. He was a member of a community that loved him enough to search for him, to fight for him, and to refuse, year after year, to let his name slip quietly out of the world. He was, by every account anyone has ever offered, an ordinary, decent man living an ordinary, decent life. And he deserved so much better than a mystery for an ending. So tonight, as you sit with Henry's story, I would ask you to try to remember him, not for the 2 minutes the internet knows him by, but for the years it does not. Not for the sound of his worst moment, but for the shape of his life. A man getting ready for work on a Monday morning, a father coming home to 2 kids, a husband on the phone with his wife across the country talking about nothing in particular, the way you do when you assume there will always be another call. That is the Henry his family knew. That is the Henry worth holding on to. The frightened voice on that recording is not who he was. It is only how the world lost him. There is a lesson in this that is quiet and easy to miss, and it has nothing to do with mysteries or theories. It is simply this: watch out for the people at the edges of your night. Walk your friend to the door. Notice when someone reliable goes silent. Take the small alarms seriously, because almost every one of these stories has, buried somewhere in it, a moment where ordinary care might have changed the ending, and almost none of us recognize those moments while we are living inside them. We only see them afterward, in the retelling, when it is too late to walk back and do the small thing that mattered. Henry's story cannot be rewritten, but the attention it sharpens in us can still protect someone else. We may never know exactly what happened in that missing hour. It is entirely possible that the truth drowned with Henry in Rush Lake and that no living person carries the answer. But it is also possible that someone, somewhere, has been holding a piece of this for a very long time. A memory, a detail, something said or seen or done that has never been spoken aloud. If that person is out there, then Henry's story is not truly finished. It is only waiting. His name was Henry McCabe. He was loved, and he is missed, and he is still remembered. His story is still unfinished, and somewhere, perhaps, someone still knows why.